Hi everyone. We are starting our first chapter, which is an introduction to biology. And in this chapter, we're going to kind of summarize some of the main concepts and things that we're going to be seeing throughout the entire semester. Okay, so let's get started. And the first thing I want to just bring up, and I'm sure you thought of this as you signed up for this course, is just what does biology mean? And don't let that picture make you think it's all about breathing, because that's part of it, but just what is the study of biology? So hopefully the words study of life come to mind. That's what most people will say when you ask them what biology is. So what is that? Study of life, study of living things. So that is really, really broad, right? So we're talking about studying the human body, looking at breathing, lungs, blood, all the anatomy, physiology, what happens within the cell, cellular respiration. So stuff about humans and the human body and all the medical stuff you would think of. But there's other things that are alive as well, right? So you think about plants, you think about other animals, you think about marine life, insects in a rainforest, you think about algae, think about moss growing on the ground, on rocks, think of lichens on tree bark, think about all the little things that we can't see with our eyes. So, bacteria, thinking about viruses, all these other organisms called protists, which we'll talk about. So, uh, lots of different kinds of organisms, right? All of biodiversity. And then the study of those things and how they work and how they're put together and their DNA and then their ecology, their evolution, everything about them. Okay, so it's a really, really broad subject. And so what I'm going to try to do this entire semester is to teach you a little bit about all of these things. It's a lot of stuff, but just so you know, everything we go over, any little sentence we go over, you can spend your entire life just studying that and researching that. Okay, and there'd be still a lot more that we need to know about it. Okay, so why would you study biology? Well, probably most of you are taking this class because it's a GE requirement. But beyond that, why did you pick this one as opposed to some other life science course? Well, for me, some of the reasons that I would want you to uh, what I would want you to get out of this course is to become a little bit more informed about different social and ethical issues. So, a lot of stuff in the media all the time that's related to biology, and if you haven't noticed it throughout this course, you'll recognize some of these things, and then as you're watching the news or looking online or whatever, you'll connect those dots, and it's really important for me to have you be able to connect those dots. Okay. An example I've got here is this cat that uh, has a gene from another organism added into it so the cat glows. Okay, they're actually using cats to do research, and so this isn't just for fun. Although, should we do that? Should we start making cats that glow in the dark in different colors? We could potentially do it. Should we? That's where the ethical issues come from. If it's not harming the cat, is that okay? I don't have an answer for you. I don't know. All right, you can learn about your body. We already kind of talked about that, right? Why do I breathe? Where does the oxygen do? What is it? Why am I breathing out more carbon dioxide when I run than when I'm not running? All of those things we'll be able to touch on. So again, more on that in an anatomy or physiology course, but we will get into it a little bit. Career opportunities in biology. Most people think with biology, all you can do is get in the medical field, right? And that's a big portion of biologists. That's what they do. But there's so many different jobs in biology that you've probably never thought of. And hopefully this course will help introduce you to some of those. And then just appreciating the world a little bit better. You are in with all these living organisms that are so cool and have the coolest interactions. And so hopefully, my goal again for you guys is that as you're walking down the hall, going from one class to another, maybe you'll notice some stuff that you didn't notice before. Maybe as you're waiting outside the classroom for the door to open, you'll notice this little bee that's pollinating a flower, and you'll notice the pollen on its back, and you'll know a little bit about it, and you'll pay a little bit more attention, and it'll be a more fun 2 minutes waiting for your class to start. So hopefully I can get you to appreciate all these living organisms and notice them in a different way than you do now. All right, so it's kind of my goals for you guys, okay? So now let's start and talk about what are these living organisms? What do they have in common? And what are some main themes that we're going to be seeing? So, all living organisms seem to have some sort of order to them, some sort of ordered structure. So, for example, this is the center of a sunflower, and you can see that that's orderly. But then you get into the cells, and you notice that there's an order within the cells. And you'll notice if you get into just the nucleus of the cell and look at the DNA, there's a certain order and structure. And within the molecules of DNA, there's an order and structure. And within the atoms, there's an order and structure. So as you get closer and closer at each level, you'll notice certain order and structure within it. And you see that with all living things. All living things, another thing they do is they all reproduce. Okay, so they all make more individuals, right? And so as we go through, we'll talk about how that reproduction happens with the cells making more cells, how growth happens, and then we'll talk about asexual and sexual reproduction as well. Now, if you're writing these down in your notes, you might notice they are out of order on purpose. So hopefully you didn't put order down for your number one on your notes. So look and see which one talks about complex organization, right? And then reproduction. Okay, so look for that. Which one would fit with reproduction? So if you have to pause this at any time and go back and work on those notes, you can do that. Okay, so reproduction, we got that one. So next we've got growth and development. Okay, so as I said, we're going to talk a lot about DNA and to look at how the DNA replicates, cell replicate, and cells make more cells, and that's how growth and development happens. So we will get into this when we get into our mitosis and meiosis section. Energy processes. All living things need some sort of energy, right? So where do they get their energy from? Well, it depends on the organism. So chemical energy being transferred into the organism can happen by photosynthesis if we're talking about plants and some other green things. For animals, we eat, so we get our energy from other organisms. And then we've got fungi and other organisms that are similar to fungi that absorb their energy. So we'll get into those categories, and that's actually one of the main ways that we group the different kingdoms is by how they get their energy. Plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, fungus kingdom. Okay, regulation. So which one would that be? So look through and see. So for regulation, we regulate our the way our body runs. For example, the temperature of our body, the pH of our blood. We're able to keep it constant, and we do it in different ways. So, for example, the reason I've got the lizard picture here is the way reptiles thermoregulates different than the way we do. By food, we use energy from food to keep our body at a certain temperature at all times. So our body doesn't cool down if we're in the shade and then heat up when we're in the sun, right? We just do it internally with food. So we need more food. With reptiles, regulate it behaviorally. So they can maintain their body temperature and keep it warm or cool based on where they're sitting. So this lizard here is sitting on a rock that's probably warm out in the sun so it can warm up for the day. Okay. So that would be regulation to keep the internal environment constant. Okay, response to the environment. All organisms respond in some way or another. Now, for us, things that move fast are cooler. So we think, oh, animals move, but plants don't really move, except for maybe a Venus flytrap. But plants do move as well. They just move really, really slowly. If you've ever seen those like time-lapse videos of plants moving, of leaves moving, flowers moving, you'll know what I'm talking about. So we do have that as well. And then the last thing, which is actually going to be a common theme that we'll see throughout this entire semester, is evolutionary adaptation. Okay, traits on organisms are all controlled by their DNA, and so there's this complex process of natural selection that leads to evolution, and we see that populations and species are constantly changing and evolving to the changing environment that they live in. Okay, so we're going to come back to that and look at that. So hopefully you got these all in the right order on your notes. All right, now we can move on to the next part. So we're going to do, when we do especially our ecology section, we're going to spend some time looking at every level. So we talked about organization and the order, right? So at every level, uh, there's certain things that pop out that we can study. Okay, and so if you decided this class was so cool you want to become a biologist, you might care to look at one level or another as a biologist. Maybe one level is more interesting to you than another. And so start with the biosphere. Okay, so that's the biggest level there, right? And we're going to kind of work our way down. And if you notice on your notes, I left you room for definitions. So what I'd like you to do is to go to your textbook, go to chapter 1 in your textbook, and read the definitions from the book, and then maybe paraphrase it for yourself and write down definitions the way you would understand them. And so this could be a cool little matching section on an exam, right? I could give you a chunk of these definitions, and then I could give you the words and have you put them in the right order. That's one way I would test this. Okay, so biosphere is the biggest one, right? And then from biosphere, you've got ecosystem. So in an ecosystem, it's a particular type of environment with certain biotic and abiotic conditions. So living things are a certain way, and the non-living things like the temperature, the climate, things like that are a certain way. And so the example here, the biosphere would be Florida, the ecosystem would be the Florida Everglades. Okay, now within that ecosystem, you've got a community. Okay, these are the organisms. So this is now lacking the non-living parts of the environment. So we're not really maybe looking at the temperature and the rainfall and soil and things like that, and water and things like that. Maybe we're just looking at the relationship between the organisms. Okay, that would be the community. So maybe in this community, we're looking at a community of a wetland ecosystem. Below that would be population. Okay, so maybe you don't care so much about the interactions between the different species of organisms, you just really care about the crocodile, or I'm sorry, the alligators. Okay, so you just want to study the population of alligators that live in the Everglades in the wetland ecosystem. Okay, next level, then maybe you don't even care about all the different individuals in that population. You just want to study the organism American alligator. That's all you care about. Okay, so that would be the next level. So all of this page is kind of more of the ecology side, kind of bigger picture stuff. On the next page, we get into more smaller stuff. Okay, so more of a micro level. Okay, so we've got our organism. Next, maybe you are more of a physiologist and you care not so much about studying the organism, but you want to study a particular system. Maybe you care really about the nervous system. Okay, that would be one of the organ systems of the many, right? Or maybe you care about one organ. You just really want to know about the brain of these American alligators. Okay. So I kind of want you to think about, which one you like better, because there's so many different levels. For me, I really like community. Okay, I love the interactions between the different organisms and just looking at how all the different organisms adapt, whether there's mutualism or competition or predation, or that's super cool to me. Okay, and I teach some ecology courses, so that's kind of where I am. Another professor you might meet might be like, "Oh no, God, it's all about the organs. Gosh, the brain is so cool," and that's what they really care about. That's their passion. So think about which one you like. Okay, so an organ is made up of many different tissues. Okay, so maybe you like the nervous tissue. You think the nerves are so cool, and all the interactions between the nerves are super cool, and that's what you want to study, right? Or maybe just one nerve cell. Why is this nerve cell the way it is, and why is it so different, and what does it do? Okay. So looking at a cell, then let's get a little closer to that. You've got an organelle. Maybe you care about the specific organelles, right? Maybe the mitochondria, or maybe, the Golgi or some other organelle. Maybe you care about the nucleus. You just want to know about the DNA of nerve cells in the American alligator. Someone studies that, I'm sure. Or you're more of a biochemist or maybe organic chemist or something, and you care about the molecules more, right? So you just really want to know about that DNA. Or maybe you are a biologist, you're not a chemist biologist, but you're a biologist and you care about the genetics and you just want to learn about the genes of the nerve cells of the American alligator. And so you spend a lot of time sequencing genes and looking at the difference between them. And maybe you even study evolution and you look at the genetic differences and compare them between populations or something. Okay. And then, of course, the DNA molecules are made up of atoms. And, then there's like the protons and electrons and neutrons that make up the atom and so on. So much, right, to all fit into one semester of biology. So my job is very, very difficult. All right, so again, get those definitions from the textbook. Really important to do so because they will show up on your exam. And let's move on. All right, so I'm going to highlight some of the levels we just went over. Okay, so we went over cells, talked about cells. We're going to spend a lot of time on cells. There's two main chapters on cells and how cells function and work. So we will get to those eventually. So cells are considered the smallest unit of life, not to be confused with the smallest unit of matter, which is atoms. Okay, so smallest unit of which one, right? And so you've got eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells are the type that we have. Prokaryotic cells, bacteria, have prokaryotic cells. Certain differences between them. We're going to come back. We're going to learn about them later. But this is the lowest level of structure that performs all the activities that make you alive. Okay, so you could be a single-celled organism and still be considered alive, like a bacteria cell. Okay, there are single-celled eukaryotic cells as well. Not humans, we're multicellular, but you could be one cell and still be considered a live organism. So that's kind of cool. That's the lowest level. All right, so prokaryotic cells are smaller, right? And so prokaryotic, the term comes from pre or before nucleus because they don't have a membrane around their DNA. And then they're all unicellular. And then eukaryotic, U means true. So that is, we think, evolved later. And so there's actually a membrane around the DNA. And there's organelles and there's sizes. The sizes get bigger and stuff too. So there's other stuff about them. And so we have unicellular and multicellular eukaryotic cells. You are, of course, multicellular. All right, and then a little bit on interaction with the environment. So, like I told you guys again, that I think is super cool. So I get more excited on the ecology stuff than I do on the other stuff. But we are going to spend a lot of time looking at energy flow, for example, looking at cycling. So energy cycles through, carbon cycles through, water cycles through, sulfur, phosphorus, all these nitrogen, all these things cycle through. It's kind of cool to see it all sort of just get recycled on Earth. It's the same atoms that are reused in different ways. And so one of the cycles is the energy cycle, right? And so here's the sun shines down. You've got producers like plants that make their own food, which becomes food for animals. And then they move around and do things and they release heat and then they get eaten by other stuff. And you just kind of got this flow of energy through organisms. So that's kind of cool. So we'll come back to that. So the producers, again, every time I say producers, these are organisms that are making their own food. So think plants, but then don't forget about all the other green things like in the ocean and in water, all the algae and stuff and seaweed and all those guys too. And then the consumers, we're consumers, right? So we eat plants, we eat animals. There's consumers that are carnivores strictly or herbivores strictly or omnivores like us. And there's different levels of consumers, right? And then you've got your decomposers, right? I talked about the kingdoms, like don't forget about fungus, right? So they break down waste and recycle all those different atoms back into the ecosystem, which is kind of cool because then it just keeps getting reused. So we do have all these interactions, all these awesome interactions between different organisms. Okay, so I want you to take a little break, take a second, think of some examples of producers and some examples of consumers and write them down. Just make yourself a little list, just kind of brainstorm, take a breather, drink some water, and then continue. All right. So we're going to now move on to evolution, which was another concept that I brought up. And we've really got evolution and science left. So I'll finish evolution and then we'll do science on a different video. Okay, so this is again going to be a core theme in biology. What's cool about evolution is that everything in biology can be explained through evolution. Okay, so anything you ask me about, how does this relate to evolution, I could give you an answer, which is super cool. We don't have any other concept that can do that in biology. All right, so what does it explain? It explains the unity of life. So how we're all related and how certain things just work the same way regardless of what kind of organism you're talking about. And it also explains the diversity of life, how things are different and what makes them different. And so hopefully that unity and diversity and how that relates to evolution will kind of become very clear to you at the end of the semester. That's one of my hopes for you for the end of the term. So it explains, here's our definition, diversity of life, and accounts for similarities and differences between species from all the way back to the first cells to now. So that's kind of a big thing to say. So if I can kind of show you that by the end of the semester, I would think that you'd be pretty happy, right? So we'll get into that. So I think of evolution, and a lot of people think of Charles Darwin right away, or the origin of species, because that's what he was famous for. He actually popularized the theory of evolution. A lot of people think by mistake that he was the first one that even said life can change over time, but that's not true. Evolution was actually being worked on by a lot of scientists, but he's the one that popularized it in his book Origin of Species. He did that, which was really big. And then he also came up with a mechanism for it, which was really big. Okay. So Darwin proposed a mechanism called natural selection, and that was, one of the biggest things that we got from Darwin. Turns out that this mechanism, natural selection, was actually described by Darwin and Wallace around the same time, and so there's a whole cool story about how that happens and how they kind of stumble upon, well, Wallace kind of stumbles upon the same thing that Darwin has been working on without knowing. So that's kind of interesting. So always remember for natural selection that we got Darwin and Wallace. So Alfred Russel Wallace proposes it at the same time. And so what is natural selection? So I'll give you the definition and then we'll go through and look at it with an example. Okay, so natural selection says that there has to be variation in the population for you to actually see change over time, which means all your individuals in your population can't be exactly the same genetically. If they're all exactly the same with all of their genes, then we're not going to see evolution. Okay. Okay, and then there's always overproduction. So there's always too many individuals and not enough resources, right? Because organisms, all kinds of organisms, just reproduce and reproduce and reproduce. They have the ability to make lots and lots of children, but what limits them is there's not enough food, there's not enough space, etc., right? There's always this overproduction, and because there's variation between the individuals and there's overproduction, we get this unequal reproductive success, meaning that some individuals happen to do better in that environment and others happen to do worse in that environment. Okay, and so as time goes by, the ones that do better have more babies, they live longer, so they have more babies, they pass on their genes. The ones that don't do well in that environment end up dying before they have babies, right? So we start to see a change with that variation causing some traits to survive more than other traits. Okay, so accumulation of favorable traits. Okay, so that was a lot. Let's look at that in an example. All right. So first, before that, again, as you're studying for your exam, I make these little boxes that are kind of important because they show up on your exams. So make sure you know two scientists that first described natural selection, Darwin and Wallace, right? All right, so let's look at this definition of natural selection using beetles. Okay, so here's a population of beetles. Pretend you're outside, you see these beetles, and so if you looked at this population, we know a population is a bunch of individuals living in the same area because you already went in and did your definitions in your textbook, right? They're all the same species, they can all reproduce. Okay, What's my variation here? Okay, so the variation that we're looking at that's obvious here is color, right? Some are light, some are dark. You guys probably already know I'm going to get into the camouflage thing, right? Okay, so we have a population and there's genetic variation. All right, so these guys um, are going to end up with a predator. But now let's see, what do we have here? Oh, mutations. We're going to come back to mutations. So mutations are actually little mistakes that are made in the DNA when DNA is making more DNA. And those mistakes, most of the time, don't do anything. Sometimes they change the organism for the worse. Sometimes they change it for the better. Okay. And so these beetles at first didn't all start off with all these different colors, right? Maybe they all kind of started with the same color, and then there was a mistake. Maybe less pigment was made in some of them, and then a little bit less pigment in some of the other ones. So these were little mistakes that were made, and sometimes these mistakes end up being beneficial, and so that's kind of how we got this variation. Okay, so we got a population. They have a predator. It's a bird. Bird flies by, picks a beetle, and goes off. Bird flies by, picks a beetle, and goes off. Keeps happening. Now, the bird doesn't care which beetle it eats. Let's pretend they all have equal amount of nutrition and calories, okay? Bird's going to pick up the first one it sees. And which color do you think it's going to see first? You think it's going to see the darker ones first? Like when you look at this, when you look away and you look at the beetle pictures, which one do you see first? Like, do you see that one? You see that one? Or do you see that one? I see that one right there. Okay, so we see the lighter ones because they stand out. They're not camouflaged, right? Same with the bird. Bird doesn't care which one to eat, but it's going to see the light one. Okay, so elimination of individuals with the least adaptive trait. All right, so as this goes on for years and years and years, generations and generations, through time, something starts to happen. The lighter ones are getting eaten and not having babies. The darker ones are staying alive long enough to have babies. Now, given, let's say light ones only have light babies and dark ones only have dark babies, and we're going to just ignore some of the dominant recessive mixed stuff. Okay, so we can come back to that later. Through time, we would assume that our population gets darker, right? So an increase in frequency of adaptive traits. So this entire process is called natural selection. So nature selecting who lives and who dies. Okay, and I have here until the environment changes again. Now let's pretend this is at the beach and this was in an area that was dark all the time, right? And let's say that some developer came in and put in a bunch of condos and put lights on the sand where these little guys hung out. And now at night, it's white sand and it's lit up. What's going to happen? Now all of a sudden being lighter is better, right? So darker ones are going to get eaten, lighter ones are going to camouflage, and so now all of a sudden the environments change and being lighter is better. Okay? 10 years later, condos didn't do well, they got torn down, lights got turned off. Flips back again. And so a lot of people think that evolution is progressive in some way. Sometimes it just flip-flops back and forth. It just depends on the environment. It's just changing. It's not becoming better or improving in some, miraculous way. It's just changing. All right, so hopefully that helps you understand the process of natural selection. It always works better explaining it in an example than it does by just a definition. Okay, and so I've been talking about genes and we haven't really gotten into DNA and genes, but that genetic variation, of course, is happening within each cell's nucleus, right? So there's this DNA sequence, and we're going to learn all about these later, within the nucleus, and there's these letters that stand for molecules that code for specific traits. And so when there's little changes within those traits, within these letters, it changes the traits slightly. And so, if you had a lot of pigmentation, now all of a sudden your code is different and it tells the cell not to make the pigmentation. Now you're lighter in color, for example. Okay. So each section of DNA that codes for a trait is called a gene. Okay, so it's a unit of inheritance, and you pass that on as your cells make more cells, and as you make more offspring, you pass these genes on to your offspring. And so, like I said, these genes, these sections of DNA are coding for specific proteins, which make your traits for you, right? So they're, making melanin or pigmentation, or making curly hair versus straight hair, or making darker skin versus lighter skin, or you taller versus shorter, or whatever it is. So going back to looking at similarities and differences between species, we really need all this DNA to be able to do that, right? We were doing it by just looking at morphology for a long time, but DNA has been so important in doing this. We can look and compare these genes between different species, okay? And we can look at similarities and differences between them. So that's really cool by trying to figure out who's related to whom and how closely or more distantly organisms are related. We can use these genetics to study genetic disorders, okay? If we find that the same genetic disorder happens to have a sequence of genes that's different from everyone else but similar to one another, we go, okay, that's probably what's going on, right? That gene is what's causing that disorder. And then once we know that, then maybe we can figure out what that's not producing, what molecule is it not making, what protein is it not making, okay? And then maybe we can find a cure for it. Revealing evolutionary relationship between organisms. I already mentioned that. Oh, these two things are related to each other. My God, we would have never known because they don't look similar, but they happen to share a lot of DNA with one another. What's going on? So, looking at evolutionary relationship and looking at DNA at the same time is crucial. All right, and so looking at the diversity of life, we're going to start off a little bit by putting our organisms in categories. We like to do that so we can talk about them easily. And so what we've done is put all organisms on Earth that we found into 3 domains, 3 groups, okay? And these 3 domains we put on this family tree. So we think that starting off with the first cells, they were all prokaryotic cells, didn't have a nucleus, they were small, didn't have organelles, they weren't very complex at first. And so these guys started off and at some point branched off into 2 categories. We got some that eventually evolved to what we call bacteria, and then some others that continued on and then split into archaea and eukarya. Archaea, we don't know a huge amount about. We're still learning a lot about. They superficially look like bacteria, but they're actually genetically and physiologically very different. But they actually split off a lot later. So we got bacteria, we got archaea, and then we got eukarya. Within eukarya, we got this huge diversification where we have some single-celled eukarya, and then we got a bunch of multicellular eukarya. Okay? And so prokaryotic for bacteria, prokaryotic for archaea, eukaryotic obviously for eukarya. We got some kingdoms under eukarya, right? We got the plant kingdom, we got the fungus kingdom, we got the animal kingdom, and then we've got this group called protists, which is all the other stuff that we haven't quite figured out the relationship between. So that's like a group, it's not really a kingdom. All right, so we've identified about 1.8 million species. A lot of these we've just been like, oh, look, it's different, but that's as far as we've gotten. We haven't learned a whole bunch about them yet, okay? So we don't know a lot about life, especially because we estimate there's about 10 to 100 million species on Earth. So we know a very, 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 very small fraction of what's actually out there, which is kind of exciting, right? Because I can get you guys to go discover all the other ones, right? So from domains, we put things into kingdoms, and then within each kingdom, we have phylum, and then, it goes kind of through all the different groups, which we will visit eventually. All right, so this question comes up on the exam and the final every single semester. So name the 3 domains of life. And so what happens is I do my choices like bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, bacteria, prokarya, and eukarya, archaea, prokarya, bacteria. So I mess you guys up because these are cell types, prokaryote and eukaryote, And so those are cell types, they're not domains, but I want domains. So I want bacteria, archaea, eukarya. So don't forget that, okay? Really important. We do this whole biodiversity section, so hopefully that'll help. All right, so then under the domain eukarya, name the three kingdoms and the group. So this helps me make sure you guys know that there's not four kingdoms, right? There's one group that's weird, which we'll talk about later, and then there's our three kingdoms. So another really good test question. So as you're studying, one thing you want to do is look for those boxes, right? And make sure that you have answers. Sometimes I look at people's notes and they don't have anything filled in the boxes. And I'm like, really? Like you're writing everything down except the stuff on the exam? Why would you do that? Okay, I've kind of said this, I think, but let's write it down again. Bacteria are all unicellular, right? So they are made up of, one individual is made up of one cell. What do you think archaea is? Also unicellular. Okay, tricky question, trick question for you. Okay, for eukarya, would you put unicellular or multicellular? Depends, right? So you're multicellular, but there's some eukarya that are single-celled. So that's going to be one or the other based on which group. Okay. So under eukarya, again, we've got plants that photosynthesize. They make their own food. We've got fungi that absorb. Remember that energy again, how they get energy. So fungi absorb, and then animals ingest. And protists kind of do, God knows, whatever. They do some photosynthesize, some absorb, some ingest and photosynthesize. They're all over the place. Okay, so we don't have to worry about distinguishing between those just quite yet until we learn our protists. All right, so I'm going to stop this lecture here and then I'll go over the process of science in the next one.